Thank you. Good evening to you all. Commend you for coming out on such a cold evening to be here this evening. I always think when I come to Lenasia in winter, the temperature here seems to be about 3 degrees below anywhere else that I know. And tonight seems to be no exception. But I'd like to welcome all of you here this evening. And again, Shabir, yourself, to South Africa and to Lenasia. It's been a real privilege sharing these platforms with you. I'm going to remember these occasions with much affection. And to Yusuf, take the opportunity. Thank you also for your input in our meetings. This is not an easy subject this evening, not one that I personally have formed any dogmatic sort of attitude on whatsoever. I've given a lot of thought to the history of Christianity and Islam. I've gone through what the Qur'an teaches, gone through what the Bible teaches. I know pretty well what both books teach on this subject. I've been amazed over the years to just look back on a very sorry history at times of conflict, violence in religion, and not even in religion, just as you know, the whole history of the nations, as long as it goes back into history, has been one of just relentless conflict and violence. And it continues to this very day. Humans attacking fellow humans, humans annihilating fellow humans, attitudes of arrogance, murderous intentions, and so on. Thanks. When Islam began in 7th century after Jesus, it spread very quickly after the death of Muhammad. An Arab empire took over North Africa, most of the Middle East. It was even moved into Spain, conquered most of Spain by 750 AD, even moved into parts of France, moved into other parts of Europe on the eastern side. And the Christian world got a shock. It was suddenly being invaded by armies and nations that it did not know. And its initial reaction was militant. To some extent, you might well understand that in the context of what they were experiencing. But the militancy grew to a point where about 300 years later, the Christian world felt it could fight back. And Pope Urbanus IV, I think it was, he decided to call for what is called the First Crusade, and promised every single Christian who went in as a warrior, as a knight, or whatever, to fight the Crusades against the Muslims, to go to what is now Israel, to go to the land of Palestine and conquer it, and anywhere into the Middle East where Muslims were, they were all promised that they would go to heaven. Any one of them who died in battle would go straight to heaven. Something similar to the Muslim concept of a shaheed, a martyr who becomes a witness and goes straight to heaven if he dies in battle. Once the Crusades were finally over some centuries later, they went on for about 300 years, and I think there were 14 actual deliberate crusades, but crusading went on for centuries, Christians invading the Muslim world. When that ended, and the Western world became stronger, Europe became strong, the Industrial Revolution came, they were able to now actually conquer other nations because of their strength. The Christian attitude to the Muslim world changed to indifference. No longer was perceived as a threat. In those days, you were described as Muslims as the Turk or the Saracen or at best Mohammedans, but whatever you were the enemies of the Christian people of Europe. But by then, there didn't seem to be any threat, so Western world generally just ignored Islam. And in fact, that continued right through to about 1979. Ignorance of Islam was just so pervasive in the Western world until then that it stunned me because I myself was ignorant of it. When I first met a Muslim couple and started to share the gospel of Jesus with them way back in January 1973, I have to confess I didn't even know the name of your religion. I only knew 4 M's, I think, and 1 A. I knew Muhammad, I knew mosques, Mecca, I knew Allah, and another M, Muslims. Yeah, that I knew. But I could have told you nothing more about your religion, even though in the town I lived there were 5,000 Muslims. Just shows how ignorant we were. And in the next 6 years, I got to know Islam well. My debate with Ahmad Didat came about within 2-3 years after that. But I, again, myself, was somewhat surprised at the Christian world's indifference to Islam until 1979. And when the Islamic Revolution came to Iran and the American hostage crisis followed soon afterwards, the Western world suddenly began to wake up to the Muslim presence again. And that awakening has just grown and grown and grown, as I'm sure you all know, in the last 30-odd years since that time. And I hoped at the time that it would lead to a changed attitude, certainly among Christians, because I always thought, well, we've had an attitude, firstly, of militancy, and then of indifference. And I thought, now maybe it'll give way to an attitude of love, compassion, understanding, and a genuine Christian response to the Muslim world. But I was very disappointed to see that generally the response again became militant. In the early days, not necessarily deliberately militant in terms of raising up armies to invade Muslim countries, not at all, but just generally, I found the Christian attitude to Islam again becoming generally militant. And I have to confess that I find that everywhere I go to this day. And I long for the day when we portray to the Muslim world the only attitude that I believe the Christian can show, and that's an attitude of love and compassion, which is the way Jesus would have treated the situation if he was here today. I hear many things to this day in circles, Christian circles and others, that to me are just not true. And I'm going to have to deal with some of these myths because I'd like to see a very different attitude from the Christian world. One of the problems we have is, if you watch, for example, the British Lions playing South Africa today and you looked at Loftus Versfeld, normally that is just a sea of blue flags and the blue bulls. Well, today it was just South Africa on the one side and then just a sea of red. And everybody sits in direct opposition to each other. And as I always say, if the referee penalises your player, well, there's something wrong with the ref. He doesn't know what he's doing. But if he penalises the opposition, well and good. And that's just a human sentiment to us, that we always think we're in the right. As somebody once said, that patriotism can be very simply defined. My country is in the right because I belong to it. It's almost a self-focus, that because I belong to this religion, or I belong to that country, or I belong to this movement, or whatever, therefore it must be the right one. For no other reason than this is the side of the road that I'm on. And then we just see everything in a sort of polarized manner. We're in the right, they're in the wrong. When I was a kid, little girls used to say to us as boys, what is that saying? Little girls are made of sugar and spice and all things nice, and little boys are made of frogs and snails and puppy dogs' tails. And you remember all that? I remember that as a kid. But again, it's that polarized attitude. We're great and you're not. And that attitude, unfortunately, persists to this day. And I need to, in my view, deal with some of the myths that I hear continuously. I'm especially speaking for Christian people here this evening to give thought to this. First thing I've always heard is that Islam was spread by the sword. Now, we're talking here tonight about the questions of peace and violence. And if Islam was spread by the sword, deliberately, the religion itself, and if that was the intention of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, then Islam by nature is inherently violent. I don't believe that for 1 minute. The history of the Muslim nations of the world, there have been centuries where Muslim countries have been at peace with themselves and the world. I personally do not see that Islam is inherently violent at all, as people think. It was not spread by the sword. If you study history objectively, what happened was that after the death of Muhammad, the whole peninsula of Saudi Arabia as it is today had become Muslim, and as a result had been united in a common faith and had been transformed. They were very different to what they'd been 30 or 40 years earlier. But there was a gap and there was a vacuum in the world through the constant wars between the Persians and the Romans, who were the two sort of strong powers of the day. And the Arabs found themselves galvanized, motivated, and they moved across the world, across North Africa, across the Middle East, facing very little opposition. You can criticize it from a Christian point of view if you want to. You can say, well, it's wrong, you shouldn't do that, shouldn't fight wars, you shouldn't subjugate other people. But that's been happening for centuries. Everywhere you look in the history of the human race, the strong can't resist attacking the weak. And when I look at it, I say to myself, well, judge the Arab conquest as you like, judge the formation of the empire as you like, but to say that this was a deliberate attempt to spread Islam by the sword is another thing. Islam went in the wake of that conquest. The aim was not to spread Islam by the sword. That wasn't the intention. It was an Arab conquest to create an empire, and because the Arabs were Muslim, Islam went in its wake. In other words, it was just natural that they would settle down, and wherever they'd conquered, they would establish Islam as their religion. What particularly strikes me always when you study in the Middle East is that the Quranic teaching and the Muslim belief about the role of subject people, especially non-Muslims, for example, the dhimmi, which is the Jews or the Christians, is that they should pay, just for the protection that the Muslim government would give them, they would pay what is called a jizya, a poll tax. And many of them didn't like this, so they converted to Islam just out of expediency, just to avoid paying that tax. And the Muslim leaders of the day didn't like this. They didn't like this converting to Islam just out of expediency. And so they really wanted these people to stay as they were, and offered them the protection as long as they paid whatever the taxes were, which to me is just one of the factors that shows that the intention was not to forcibly, by bloodshed, spread Islam. When I say Islam went in the wake, it's the same thing with Christianity in Africa. It came in the wake of the sword. It wasn't Christianity that was spread by the sword. When the British and the others came down here into southern Africa, the Dutch, even the Germans came here. When they came and they conquered most of Africa, certainly south of the Sahara, the intention was not to establish Christianity here, not at all. The intention was just simply to spread the empires, particularly the British Empire, by gunboat diplomacy or by any other means. Christianity came in its wake. Because these people were Christian, naturally they sort of put up churches, and then Christian missions and things came in because it was now a world where you could propagate, promote, extend the Christian faith without expecting too much opposition. Arab Empire, the Arab conquest was the same. It's just a phenomenon. And one needs to distinguish this between what is said to be spreading religion by the sword, or where religion is just simply follows the conquest of nations just inherently because it's the religion of the people who follow it. When we look at the subject of jihad, jihad is actually a Muslim expression, comes from the Qur'an, the word jihada, meaning to struggle. The Qur'an advocates it in many places, does call on Muslims to fight, particularly against unbelievers, and states plainly, slay the unbelievers in battle. If you as a Christian look at this, and I've heard many Christians take hold of this and say, well, there again, Islam is an inherently violent religion. I've even heard Christians say to me that the only true Muslims are the ones who belong to Al-Qaeda, who are fanatics and terrorists, and that all the peace-loving Muslims in the world, if they were true Muslims, they would follow the injunction of the Quran to be as violent as they could be. And I hear this sort of thing, it makes my hair stand on end. Certainly it doesn't make for good relations between Christians and Muslims. But it's not true. To the extent that the Quran does advocate violence in terms of warfare, perhaps, religious warfare, a Muslim could easily turn a finger on the Christian Bible and say, well, just go back to the Old Testament and just read how God spoke to the nation of Israel when they went into the land of Canaan, what is Palestine, what is Israel today, and just what they were told to do. And they were told to destroy everything in their path. They were told to wipe out the cities, to destroy and annihilate populations, pregnant women, children, didn't matter. And that, the Bible tells you, clearly came from the command of God. And in fact, when they came to Jericho, which was the first city which they attacked and conquered, Joshua 6:21, everything, men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, asses, everything had to be put to the sword. God's intention was to create for himself one nation that he could deal with, that he could bring into a discipline, bring into a relationship with him. That's what he wanted. He would promise to live among his people, to manifest his presence, and he promised them that if they were true to him, he'd be true to them, and all would be well. But he saw these other nations that were idolatrous, wicked to the core. He said, these people are bad, wipe them out, get them out of the way. Otherwise, they're going to tempt you, they're going to distract you away, and for that reason, destroy them. Well, think of it as you like. That is what the Bible teaches. In Joshua 8, verse 25, when the Israelites conquered Ai, smaller town just to the north of Jericho, they put 12,000 men and women to the sword. I mean, these were slaughters of huge numbers. In Joshua 10, you find that the towns of Lachish, Libnah, Eglon, Hebron were all put to the sword, and all by the commandment of God. And Joshua 11:20 says, it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle in order that they should be utterly destroyed and should receive no mercy, but be exterminated as the Lord commanded Moses. So we're not in a position as Christians who hold that Bible and who accept that those passages are true and that they're correct and that that was definitely the command of God. We're not really in a very good position, in my view, to point fingers. Further, I look at today and I get back to 1979, and nobody, I don't even think Muslims, will deny that the history of the Islamic attitude to the Western world has been one where there's been a considerable amount of violence. 9/11 is the obvious example, where Arabs took over hijacked aeroplanes and flew them into the Twin Towers and flew one into the Pentagon and would have sent the other into the capital or whatever. We don't know where they were aiming at. But even then, if you look back, you can see the other things like the aircraft that was hijacked and crashed over Lockerbie in Scotland. You can go to Munich in 1972 and the slaughter of all the hostages there, when Israeli hostages, and you can go back into the assassins in the history of Islam, and you can go to Jihad, and you can point fingers at Taliban and Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and you can go on. And it's there. Muslims would admit it. I had a Muslim working for me, a young Muslim lady, a secretary for some years, and she used to laugh. When her husband was transferred to England, she said they're having a bit of difficulty getting things going. And I said, no, what is the problem? She said, well, Mr. Gilchrist, you know what it's like. She said, not all Muslims are terrorists. I'm sure you know that. But of course, the Western attitude is all terrorists are Muslims. So every one of us gets screened so carefully. Well, if I have to go back again into history, if I look at what's happened in the last 30 years, you can point fingers. But I've been a bit shaken over the years as I've read the history of the Christian response to the Muslim world at different times. I don't know if you've ever heard the expression Christian Jihad. I think even to many Christians it'll be a new thing, but there's a new book out in America written by Christians called Christian Jihad. That's just what the Crusades were. It was simply taking up a sword in the name of the Christian faith, in the name of God, in the name of Jesus, and invading the Muslim world, conquering, slaughtering wherever they went, simply believing that they were doing something that would bring them much favor before God himself. And I can tell you without any hesitation that there's nothing that Al-Qaeda or anybody else has done in recent times is not matched by some of the things that those hoary soldiers did in those days as they challenged and as they attacked the Muslim world. The Saracens, that's what Muslims were called in those days, the Saracens were just seen simply as the enemies of Christianity and therefore as the enemies of God. Not to be loved, evangelized, won or anything else, but to be conquered and to be brought into subjugation. Not targets of good news, rather but targets of the gun. Kenneth Cragg says in one of his books, he said, as Christians we are not called to win battles for Christianity, we're called to win Muslims to Christ. Big difference between the two. The one is to do something that gives us a triumph, the other is to bring something beneficial into other people's lives. But in those days, in the days of the Crusades, for centuries, 3 centuries, it was a common belief, as I've read books at the time, I get stunned that this is just stated as a general fact, general attitude, that preaching and fighting in the name of religion are seen as complementary. That you go and you preach your religion, and if people won't listen, you fight them until they do. Wow. One of the popes has actually recorded as saying that there is no more effective way to get a man to change his mind than to put a sword to his throat and to threaten him immediately that if he doesn't change, his life will be taken away. Very effective way, the Pope said. The most effective way of getting a man to change his mind. Wow, that doesn't sound good. I'm sure to any Christian who hears that, it doesn't sound good. There was some genuine ministry in those days, but most of the propagation of the Christian faith was by the sword. It was forceful. Baldwin of Bourges in France, when the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem in 1099 under Godfrey de Bouillon, I don't know who he was, but one of the leaders, one of the Muslim leaders of the city was brought out, taken captive and brought out and brought before Baldwin. And he said to him, Baldwin said to him, well, you have a choice. Either you convert to Christianity right now and you get baptized in the Roman Catholic way, or we're going to behead you. the Muslim refused to convert, and he was beheaded in front of the Tower of David in Jerusalem. Wow. When I read that sort of thing as a Christian, my blood goes cold. My hair stands on end. But it also shuts me up, silences me, that I cannot point fingers from inside the Christian faith at other religions, especially to make out that Christianity is the most benign, wonderful, charitable thing the world's ever seen. Certainly not in practice. Charlemagne, who lived at the time of the Crusaders, very famous warrior, said in one of his famous sermons, I think this quote is famous, he said, "When you preach to unbelievers, preach with an iron tongue." That means the steel comes with what we're saying. And we will preach, and if you don't believe and respond and subjugate, we will fight against you. So Bernard of Clairvaux, who is canonized as a saint only recently, not long ago, by the Roman Church in 1147, said, "Surely convert," and meaning Muslims, "everybody you find in your path, or utterly annihilate the enemy." It was literally believe or perish. And that was the spirit with which they conducted the Crusades when they conquered Jerusalem. And this is recorded in Christian annals of what happened. When Jerusalem was conquered in 1099, the record in Christian books is that the blood literally flowed through the streets. Every single person, every Jew, every Muslim, anybody found there who wasn't a Christian was put to the sword. And then in 1210, Alanus Anglicanus said, "Compel Muslims to convert to Christianity by confiscation of their properties, or by scourging, not to death itself, but as close to it as you can get." I don't know with the Christians sitting here this evening if they've heard all this, but it's hairy and it's scary. Pelagius, papal legate in 1218, said that Saracen conversion, meaning the conversion of Muslims to Roman Catholicism, was the object of Christian fighting. There were a lot of other Crusader leaders who said, no, we want to get back the promised land, and we want to get the relics that are in Jerusalem back, and all the wonderful reasons and motivations they had for conquering the Muslim world. But some of them said that that was the supreme purpose of fighting. Well, after the Crusades came to nothing, eventually they died out. In the Middle Ages, by the 16th century, printing began on a sort of general basis for the first time, and people were able to start disseminating literature far more freely than before. And one of the first things to happen was to translate the Christian Bible into other languages, because the Roman Church had just only allowed people to read it, if at all, in Latin. And one of the reasons was to stop people thinking for themselves and to make sure they just simply subjected themselves to the church and to its teaching. But once people started reading the scriptures in their own language and began to see from the New Testament that New Testament Christianity, the gospel that Jesus preached, was totally different to what they were seeing going on around them, they started to react. It wasn't long before Martin Luther posted his 94 or 95 theses on the church in Wittenberg in Germany and broke away from the Catholic Church. Was excommunicated by them, but I think he went with conviction. And not only that, but